Robert Bauval has been a guest on my show previously. You've heard him come on and talk about his fantastic books in the past. Over the last 4.5 years that I've been on the air, he's joined me a few times. He's a great guest. He can definitely fill an hour with lots of fabulous information, and he joins me again tonight. His pioneering research linking the Giza pyramids and the so-called pyramid texts with astronomy led to the international bestseller, The Orion Mystery, that you're all familiar with. His more recent books include The Egypt Code and Black Genesis, and most recently, one of my favorites, The Master Game, Unmasking the Secret Rulers of the World. He writes approximately 636 pages, co-authored with Graham Hancock, tracing the master game of the New World Order. And personally, I've been waiting for Robert to come out with something like this for a long time, and I'm very proud of him. It's a fantastic book. I'm deep into it. It's a big book. It's got a lot of history in it. It's got a lot of information. It's very well researched. It's fantastic and all that. So tonight, he's going to join all of us and share some of his journey through the book and some of the pertinent information that especially aligns with the 9/11 site, the, quote, War on Terror, and where we are now with the Arab Spring and the Wall Street revolts that are taking place that you're not hearing too much about on mainstream media. But we are having a revolution of sorts. We have people down in New York City who are taking the streets and talking and peacefully rioting, arguing the financial world that really has done quite a bit of damage to all of us on this planet. So we're going to be talking about how this game coincides with that. And as usual, Robert will bring his charm to the air for all of us. Welcome, Robert.
Hi, Hillary. How are you?
Good. Very good. And you promised you'd behave yourself tonight.
I'll try. I must say that it's very appropriate to have the interview because I'm actually in Washington at the moment. And much of the master game, as you know, deals with the city of Washington, D.C. But, hello?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. You'll have to tell me when you're still on the air because this phone is acting strange. I'm talking to you from this really very old-fashioned phone at the hotel.
Well, let's give them some background. You're doing a tour in the United States. You're in the United States right now. You're doing a book tour. You were in Atlanta. You're in Washington, D.C. now, and you'll be in New York. But you've had an opportunity to walk around Washington, D.C. to see some of the sites that you've actually written about in this book, correct?
Correct. Well, I've been in Washington, D.C. several times before. But like I was saying, it's been an interesting and very propitious moment because several things have happened more or less in this week, which deals very much with the topics that I'll be talking about in a minute. One of them, of course, is the Palestinian application for recognition at the UN that took place last week. The other is I've been having a lot of fun observing the people repairing the Washington Monument, as you probably know.
Which was cracked. It was cracked in a recent earthquake.
It was, yes. Yeah. And they've had a team right at the top, and I've been in town yesterday watching them with a lot of people down, and it's quite an amazing thing. So that's the other. And the third, of course, is that I'm here.
Quite symbolic, I think. Don't you think that the monument was cracked during the earthquake? I think it speaks volumes of what we're going to be talking about tonight. And I just want to say personally that I'm very excited that you've come out and talked about this because I know you and I have had some conversations about this kind of stuff, and you've always been hesitant to really talk about this. But I want to know, and I want to ask, and I'm sure the listeners are curious, what made you decide to come out with such a really just in-depth, huge, gigantic book on the topic? Is this something that you have always been tracking, or is it something you've kind of stumbled on in your research through Egypt? How did you get to make the decision to do this book?
Let me give you the background of this book. I should very quickly say that the Master Game, which is the book that's come out last week, is in fact a update and rewrite of another book which I've written with Graham Hancock called Talisman, which was published in 2004. But Talisman has, and consequently the Master Game, has a history that goes down to about 15 years ago, when I wrote with Graham Hancock The Message of the Sphinx, my second book. I had proposed to our publishers to write a book on the influence of Egyptian symbolism on the Western world. That's the seed of this book. But and invited Graham to write it with me. So we're talking about 1993 approximately, and when we started researching in depth this topic, mainly we were tracking two traditions that have come out of Egypt. You still there, Hillary?
Yes.
Okay. We decided to track down two traditions that emerged from Egypt. One of them is the well-known Hermetic tradition, which concerns the famous books of Hermes or Thoth that were rediscovered in Italy in the Renaissance period in the 15th century, and many believe kick-started the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Age. So we wanted to track this and see the influence of this tradition across the Western world, mainly because we were aware of a variety of Egyptian symbols, obelisks and pyramids and all sorts of odd monuments in various capitals of the world, and we wanted to understand what they were doing there and if they had any deep significance. The other tradition is the Gnostic tradition, which is, in a sense, the Hermetic tradition. Now, I should explain that the Hermetic tradition is none other than the ancient Egyptian religion or cult, which was metamorphosed or converted or changed by the Greeks into a kind of philosophy. It's rather a bit complex to explain. I won't go to too much detail now.
Well, people can find it in your book. They can find it in your book, Robert, if they want more information on the background of this.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, as we said at the beginning, the book is a massive book of 630 pages or so, and in great detail, we literally sort of slink through the 2,000 years of civilization, starting with the events of Alexander the Great and leading all the way to 9/11. So you can imagine the huge historical investigation we did. We actually call it, by the way, this kind of investigation, we call it a archaeological history. We dig below the veneer of history, below the textbooks, and we try and get to the very heart of certain events like the Renaissance and the French Revolution, the American War of Independence, the Founding Fathers, and all leading to this crescendo that we're all experiencing at the moment. Now, having said this, the Master Game came about a year and a half ago when we realized that much of the research that we did for Talisman was in fact bringing us to this rather drastic and awful event, which is now in the psychic of just about everybody in the world, the 9/11 event, and what follows, the aftermath of 9/11, and reaching this point now where there's a whole confusion and nobody seems to understand what all this is about. So we set, when I say we, I'm talking about Hancock and myself, we set ourselves the task of trying to use the material of Talisman, our previous book, in order to clarify this situation that is going on now, which is basically this clash of civilization, this war on terror, and this situation with Al-Qaeda, and everybody seems to be confused about this. So ask me the next question, but I would like to start at a specific point. So I'm ready to go. Depending on your next question.
Well, I think what most people are interested in it, and, you know, the history that you trace, like we said, you can go to the book and read it. It's fascinating. But let's bring it full forward, because people are so, as you said, confused, and they just need some guidance, and they want to know from credible people what's going on. And, you know, you are very well known for what you do. You have a very huge personality, and also a wonderful reputation for really being investigative when you research and when you write. And, you know, when you call it the master game, you talk a lot about the Masonic symbolization, you know, symbols that are in these city plans. And let's kind of fast forward to more of a modern time frame that people can relate to. And then also, I want to spend some time on the 9/11, and I want to spend some time on your thoughts about the revolution, the revolting that's going on, that's not getting any press. You know, people just aren't aware of what's really happening, and what your personal thoughts are on all of this, and what you really think about the New World Order. Because for a long time, Robert, this has been kind of a conspiracy theory where people will kind of tap into it and you know, they chew on it a little bit, or they really realize that there is something going on. But there's not a lot of really clear, concise information coming, and people are getting confused, and they kind of get lost when we get into that topic. So I think we should start somewhere where we can kind of dig all of that out and make some sense of it.
Okay. What was your question?
Well, I mean, my question
okay,
is...
listen. You mentioned the key word, conspiracy. And what I'm about to talk now, and it's basic. By the way, I should tell you, I've given a talk in England last week. And so my answer will be very much modeled on this idea of conspiracy. There's been a lot of talk about what 9/11 is all about. And today, for example, I mean, there's been an astounding news on Fox, but I tend to be very skeptical about Fox News, but nonetheless, where apparently Al-Qaeda has sent a message to the president of Iran, of all people, telling him to stop accusing the United States of having been responsible for 9/11, because they're getting a bit pissed off. It's they, Al-Qaeda, who have done this, they claim. So here again is another turn of events that will confuse things more. But let me start where it should start. Mm. As you know, Hillary, I've lived half my life in the Middle East. And that's probably, in terms of years, probably your whole life in terms of years. I'm 64 years old, so I've spent about nearly 35 years in the Middle East, mostly in Egypt. But I've lived in Saudi Arabia for many years, and I've spent time in Sudan. I've even worked in Iran. So I know the Middle East very well. And let me tell you this. The conspiracy is really very much something, a psychosis, whether true or not, that has affected most people in the Middle East. They believe, and it's not just the fundamentalists. I mean, it's nearly everybody you talk to in the Middle East. They believe, Arabs believe, that there is a Zionist, Masonic, American conspiracy to take over the Middle East. Now, it may sound strange, but the belief is very fervent. And having said this, we should come down to the year 1998, because 1998 is a crucial year, and I think a lot of people missed the point. On the 23rd of February, 1998, in a newspaper called Al-Quds, which is published in London. Al-Quds means Jerusalem in Arabic. There was a full-page announcement by an organization calling itself Al-Qaeda. It's a declaration of war. You can find this on the internet. I'm usually very surprised and and amazed really that although this has been going on for the last 10 years or so, in fact 12 years, many people haven't bothered to look at this declaration. There is a translation of it on the internet, so I very much recommend your readers to have a look, because this is an actual declaration of war by Al-Qaeda against what they call the Crusaders. And very clearly in their mind, these Crusaders is the United States and Israel. And it's very bizarre because they speak of these Crusaders as if it's an ongoing situation, starting with the ancient Crusades that took place in the Middle Ages. And one needs to understand this, because if you don't understand why they believe that there is a crusade going on, we're all missing the point of what Al-Qaeda is trying to do. Now, Graham and I have set ourselves the task to try and understand why there is this belief. Why do the Arabs, and particularly Al-Qaeda, think that there is some sort of crusade going on against them, and that their declaration of war is, in a sense, a holy war against these American quote-unquote crusaders. So in order to understand this, one must go to the original crusades and understand what really happened and why Al-Qaeda today and the rest of the Arab world has centered its aim, its target against the United States. Because the original crusades have nothing to do with the United States. I mean, the United States didn't even exist in the Middle Ages. So the big question is, why now the United States? And I'd like to tell you that.
And
Hello?
that's my next question. No, that is my next question. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, okay. Well, having set the scene, one must go to the original story. Now, I need to be very clear on this matter, because I presume many of your readers in the United States, your listeners in the United States are probably from the Jewish faith in New York, certainly. And I want to make clear that there is a big, big difference when one speaks of the Jewish people, when one speaks of Israel, and one speaks of the Zionists. And unfortunately, there is a confusion. There is a confusion in the mind of a lot of people, and they tend to mix these tags. The Zionists have nothing to do with the Jewish people other than being an organization that kickstarted the State of Israel. So let me be clear on this. And I want to be very clear that I know it sounds like a cliche, but I am definitely not anti-Semitic in any way. I'm not anti-anything. So having said this, I would like to make sure that nobody misunderstands what I'm about to expose here, because some feathers will be ruffled. But then that's what most of my books do anyway. We need to go to the biblical times. We need, in fact, to go to 1000 BC. And this is where the story starts. The story starts with the supposed, now I say supposed because I'm a historian and I've been involved with archaeology, and the supposed formation of the kingdom of Israel, or rather the kingdom of David in 1000 BC. But let's just assume that historically all this is correct and so forth. Now, as you may or may not know, there is a lot of doubt about this. Even Israeli archaeologists are confused because no hard evidence has come to light to this day about this kingdom of David and what follows. But let's assume it did happen. There was a kingdom of David in 1000 BC. What follows is 50 years later, King Solomon builds the first temple, on Mount Moriah or Mount Zion, or the Temple Mount as most people know it. And then about 400 years later, the Solomon Temple is destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. Most people know this biblical history. And about 100 years later, the second temple is rebuilt. I'm going to go very quickly on this history because I want to bring it to contemporary times. The Romans come eventually in the first century BC. They take control of Palestine and Jerusalem and place Herod as king of the Jews. The Herodian temple is built, but again destroyed. The second temple, which stands on the mountain on Temple Mount, is destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, and that's it. That's the end of the great Solomonic temple. What's left is still there for us to see, the Wailing Wall. Now, I'm going to jump to the 7th century AD. The Romans by that time had weakened into a rather weak state in Byzantium. Jerusalem falls in the hands of a Muslim army led by Khalifa Omar, and they take Jerusalem. This takes place in about 642 or 43 BC, AD, sorry. Again, check it in the book. And so Jerusalem now is in Muslim hands as from the 7th century. And on Temple Mount, they built two of their most sacred shrines. You still there, Hillary?
Yes, do I need to breathe heavily into the microphone, Robert, so you know I'm here? Sorry, I
yes, can you do that? There's a dead silence on the other side.
Word. I'm listening very intensely, yes, as I'm sure everybody else is as well.
I think it's important to, although I'm going in a very condensed way, I think it's important.
Well, we only have an hour, so I mean it has to be, but people can read the more, they have to buy the book.
Yes. But let me get to the point here. The two most important shrines, other than the shrine in the city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia, are built on Temple Mount. One is the famous Dome on the Rock, and the other is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. They're still there. So here starts a problem. And meanwhile, of course, after the collapse of the Solomonic Temple under the Romans in 70 AD, emerges the Christianity, the events of the Gospels, and in Jerusalem are some of the most holy places of Christendom. And that is the problem. The problem is we have three major religions, all stemming, by the way, from the same source, from the Abrahamic source, from the Old Testament, if you like, who claim Jerusalem as their holy city, and particularly the Muslims and the Jews, who see the Temple Mount as the epicenter of their faith. Now, why do the Muslims see Jerusalem and Temple Mount with such importance? It's not simply because they've built their two shrines, the Dome on the Rock and the Aqsa Mosque. It's because in the Quran, it is said that Muhammad the Prophet took a journey from Mecca on a magical horse to Jerusalem, where he landed on Temple Mount, and from there ascended to heaven, there to consult the prophets and to consult God. In heaven, the Quran says he meets all the previous prophets, Moses and Jesus, John the Baptist, and also talks to God. And when he returns, he has the doctrines and the mandate to declare Islam as the final religion of the world. So this is why Jerusalem, and Temple Mount more specifically, has the significance to the Muslims. And now we have to go to Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda declaration of war in 1998. Not only they declared war against these crusaders, Americans, but the purpose of this war is to liberate the holy sites of Jerusalem, which are now in the hands of the Israelis. So you've got to understand this. This is what this war is about. It's not about oil. It's not about democracy. It's not about anything else. As far as Al-Qaeda, it is about a crusade to liberate the holy sites. And Americans need to come to terms with this, because this is what they are up against. And if it's not understood, and if it's not diffused, we're heading towards some serious trouble. Now, I have to move to another part of history, because for a long time, the Christian world, after the capture of Jerusalem by the Muslims, fought to regain Jerusalem through the various crusades that went on for nearly 500 years. The first crusade in the 11th century was what I term the first 9/11, but the other way around. Christendom, with the Knights, the Knight Templars and the Knights of St. John, attacked Jerusalem, which was now in the hands of the Muslims. There were Christians still living in the city, there were Jews living in the city, and of course Muslims. And they massacred every single individual in this city. A horrible, horrible genocide took place. And this is rooted deeply in the memory of the Arabs. This terrible, terrible. But again, after the capture of Jerusalem by the Christians, it falls in the hands again of the Muslims with the famous battle of Saladin, who conquers the Holy Land, and Jerusalem and the Holy Land becomes part of the Muslim Empire as from the 12th century onwards to this modern day. In fact, when I say modern day, till 1948. The Christians give up. They abandon the hunt for the desire to recapture Jerusalem. Everything is nice and quiet till modern times. But then something happens. Something happens that revives the whole problem all over again. You're not doing some noises, Hillary.
Oh, Robert.
I'm getting bored here on my own.
Well, I don't think so.
Okay, I'm going to carry on, because we're getting to...
Yeah, you're getting to it. I can tell. Go ahead.
We're getting to the real core of the problem here, because we're now jumping to the beginning of the 20th century. And the 20th century begins with a problem. And that problem is the manifestation of a document that emerges from Russia. It's supposed to be a hoax, which reminds me, by the way, a few days ago I was at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and they actually talk about this. I've seen the movie that they show there, and they actually talk about this document, which is known as the Protocol of the Elders of Zion. It is a document that has proved to be a fake. Unfortunately, it is taken very, very seriously by the Arab world. This document, which emerges in 1905, purports to expose a huge plot by the Jews and the Freemasons to take over the Arab world through the banking systems and through finances. And although, like I said, this document was shown to be a fake, unfortunately, it is not seen as a fake by the Arab world. In fact, it is circulated even now in many Arab countries. Egypt did a 10-part television series on this Protocol of Zion not long ago. And in Saudi Arabia, they even distributed in schools So we got to be aware of this, because this is the beginning of the psychosis that there is some kind of Jewish Freemason plot to take over the Middle East. Now, what follows is...
Can I ask you a question at this point? I need to interrupt you for a second here. There is a plan to take over the financial aspects of this world. There is a plan set up in place. And so, in fact, they are correct in what they're believing, yes?
Well, let me get to the point, because what the master game finally brings you to a point is what seems at first to be a conspiracy. When you read the master game, you end up thinking, well, perhaps it isn't a conspiracy. Perhaps it's true, because the evidence is stacking in favor of it being true. Mm-hmm. So let me just carry on, because what starts with this protocol of Zion even takes a different shape that convinces the Arabs that this plot, this conspiracy, is actually true. And now we jump to the First World War, or rather towards the end of the First World War, when the Zionists, I should say this, between the protocol of Zion and the events of the First World War, is formed the Zionist organization. It is founded by a fellow called Theodor Herz, who founds this organization in 1897, if I'm not mistaken. And by the time of the end of the First World War, it has become a rather powerful organization with its headquarters in England, headed by the famous banker Baron Rothschild. Now, the Baron Rothschild, among other Jewish bankers, were actually funding the British war effort. Most of the money of the British war effort came from these big Jewish bankers. Now, here is a moment in history. After the First World War, the Allies, which mainly involved England, the French, and the Italians, but England was the superpower at the time, decide to divide the conquered world, which is mainly North Africa and the Levant, which was in the hands of the Ottoman Empire, which has collapsed. They were the allies of the Germans. And England takes the land of Palestine in a mandate, as they call it. In other words, they become the rulers, the owners of Palestine. It's in the hands of the British, and now the Zionist organization sees its opportunity. And through an approach by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lord Balfour, who approaches the King of England and obtains from him the famous declaration known as the Balfour Declaration. It's, let me get the date right. It is actually on the 2nd of February, 1917, where Lord Balfour writes a letter to Baron Rothschild, the head of the Zionist organization in England, and announces that the King of England has favorably looked and agreed to the formation of a Jewish state in Palestine. And that's the beginning of a problem. Because what follows immediately was that this declaration, this Balfour Declaration, is taken very seriously, of course, by the Zionist organization. The Jews are in diaspora around the world. They've been persecuted in many places, in Russia and in Germany to follow, of course, later on with the Second World War. And here is an opportunity, because the British, who are in control, and they're the superpower, they're in control of Palestine, agrees to hand over, in a sense, give as a gift to the Zionist organization the land of Palestine, and starts a big immigration towards Palestine by the Jews. And they come from all over the place. They come from Russia, they come from Germany, they come from Poland, they come from the States, and they start populating Palestine, to the horror of the Arabs who live there, as you can imagine. one has to be realistic about this. There are these Arabs that reside in this land for the last 1,500 years, and they see this mass of immigrants coming over, rather sophisticated people from various parts of the European continent and from the States, and they start taking over. So one really has to understand the problem from both sides. Now, I do appreciate the problem of the Jewish people. There was a diaspora around the world. There was this dream to establish the state of Israel, but one has to understand the problem from the other side as well. And
well, Robert, you living in the Middle East for a great portion of your life and working there, I mean, that certainly gives you a different perspective. I mean, I've been to Egypt a couple times, and, most people in the Western world have not traveled over there. They have not experienced the people. They haven't experienced the culture, the cities. They don't understand the people, let alone what their life is like. And, isn't that quite the problem when it comes to war anyway? We tend to pick an enemy and hate them, and we've just been conditioned and trained to do that.
Wars throughout history have been about ideas. And oddly enough, there's never been very, very clear as to what the real purpose is. And now we have a situation where no one is clear. No one is clear. There is a whole confusion. But I think, let me finish my story, because we're going to bring it to 9/11 here, because this is where it all finally ends. We're now going to jump to 1948. We're now in 1948, and nothing has happened in Palestine. The British are still holding their mandate, and there's been now a huge import of immigration from various parts of the Jewish diaspora, and the trouble starts. Because the British are fed up of being in the middle. There is almost a civil war starting. The Arabs are shooting at the Jews are shooting at the Arabs, and the British are in the middle. The crunch comes when the terrorist organization of the Urkun, the Jewish organization, blows up the King David Hotel, where the British have their headquarters. A lot of people are killed, and this finally sends a signal to the British. They do not want to be responsible for Palestine anymore, and they turn now to the newly formed United Nations. And they say, well, listen, this is your problem. Take the problem. We relinquish our mandate, and they give a date. They say on the 14th of May, 1948, they're out. And here is now the huge opportunity by the Zionist organization. And now we're talking about individuals with Ben Gurion, Golda Meir, who are now in Palestine. They form a provisional government, a provisional Jewish government, an Israeli government, and they declare that they will announce an independent state when the British move at midnight on the 14th of May 1998. And everything depends on the support of the United States. Without the support of the United States, who are now the superpower after the Second World War, this cannot happen. And this is where we have to get to understand what happened on that day, that famous day of the 14th of May 1998. It's a crucial time. Remember that Al-Qaeda announced its declaration of war in 1998, exactly 50 years later, on the jubilee of what happened on that date. So this is what is emerging from the master game. It's very, very important. Everybody understands this. So on the 14th of May, at midnight, the British literally move out. The British commissioner boards the ship, and off they go. And at that precise moment, Ben Gurion is about to read the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, referring back to the Davidic kingdom and the Solomonic kingdom and so forth. But he needs to know whether the American president is going to support this. He needs to be sure, because without that support, that State of Israel would be literally obliterated at its infancy, because what has obviously happened is once this announcement has been made, 5 Arab states, including Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq, form a coalition and say if this declaration is made by the Zionist organization, they will attack Israel. They will attack and kill this nation at its birth. So this is where the whole thing stood. Now, here is the problem. And here is this Masonic, Zionist, American, supposedly conspiracy. The problem is that the President of the United States at the time is President Harry Truman. Harry Truman happens to be a 32nd degree Scottish Rite Freemason, the highest grade that you can obtain in Freemasonry. He happens also to be the 32nd President of the United States. And there is a huge lobbying going on with the Zionist organization in Washington. They are now based in Washington because now this is where the whole power of the world resides. They're headed by wise men who will become the first president of Israel, and they lobby heavily. Now, here it is. When Ben Gurion in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, announces and reads the Declaration of Independence, exactly 11 minutes later, President Harry Truman, without consulting Congress, without the approval of the United Nations, indeed without the consent of the Secretary of State, George Marshall, who is totally opposed to that situation. He knows that there will be war. President Harry Truman writes a short note saying that the United States government approves and accepts and condones this newly formed state, and that's it. He personally makes the decision. This is why the Arab world are convinced, not just with the protocol of Zion, which we were talking earlier on, but now they see a Masonic, highest degree President of the United States being lobbied by the Jewish organization, the Zionist organization, and making the decision himself to create the State of Israel. So no wonder they believe that this is a plot. Now, whether true or not, this is what they believe. And the danger now, it's no more crusades with horses and lancers and swords. This is heading towards an Armageddon, because we've got Iran on the one hand, rushing towards nuclear weaponry, and we have Israel on the other hand, already armed with nuclear weaponry. And God forbid if this game goes on. It's going on to capture, liberate this real estate which we call the Temple Mount. And it's got to stop. It's got to stop, because we're all being sucked in this mad game that's been going on since the Crusades, and really it has to stop. So this is what the master game is all about. We need to understand what this battle is about, why Al-Qaeda is still seeing America as a crusading power, and where all this is heading. Are you still there, Hillary?
Robert, why do you always do that to me?
Well, I don't know. I mean, you know.
You do know. You just don't ever stop talking.
You know me. If you don't stop me, I don't stop.
That's why I do know you. That's why I just shut up and listen sometimes, because it's fascinating. Okay,
well, look,
I have to ask you.
I've laid it down here, and it's now coming to 9/11.
Yes.
Coming to 9/11, because I am convinced. I have no doubt in my mind. I know a lot of people are not going to like this, but I am utterly convinced that 9/11 is purely and solely the Al-Qaeda who masterminded this attack. But there is something to understand here, because of what I've just said. This psychosis, this belief that there is a Masonic, Zionist, American plot to take over the Middle East. And more particularly, because one has to bear in mind that when Harry Truman made that decision, in the mind of the Arab, it wasn't just an American president making that decision. It was a very senior Freemason making that decision. And the Arabs know, as well as everybody else knows, that one of the objectives of the Masonic movement is the rebuilding of Solomon's temple. So there you are.
I have to interrupt you for a second. Now, the rebuilding of Solomon's temple, what about the new 9/11 memorial? What does that represent to you?
Well, let me get to 9/11 itself, because the targets that were chosen by Al-Qaeda are rather conspicuous. I don't need to repeat them. They blew up the two towers of the World Trade Center, and they attacked the Pentagon. There was a fourth flight. We're not quite sure what target it had. I'm beginning to wonder if it was, in fact, the Scottish Rite headquarters in Washington. Let me tell you why. If you tell a Freemason, any Freemason, and you say two towers or two columns and a pentagon, what flashes in his mind is the Temple of Solomon. The reason is that the rituals, the initiatory rituals of Freemasonry, one of the most important ones, known as the raising of the master, is performed on a tracing board. It's a sort of prayer rug, if you like, and on it is drawn symbolically the Temple of Solomon. And it's represented by two columns and a pentagon. So the choice of Al-Qaeda choosing those targets immediately, to people who know symbolism and know Masonic symbolism in particular, rings the Temple of Solomon. It's as if they're attacking the American Temple of Solomon. It's kind of weird, but that's how it comes through. The game is entirely symbolic here. The battle is symbolic, because ultimately they're fighting over a symbol. The symbol is a rock on Temple Mount. That's what it's about. It's a huge talisman that has haunted the Western world and now the modern world in an incredible way. You were asking about the memorial. Sorry, the memorial you're talking about in New York.
Yes.
Well, that's another weird one. I haven't got very much into that, but certainly it's been the tower that they will raise has, let me get this right, 1,776 feet. Is that right?
Well, Robert, I'm going to send you a copy of a show that I did recently, a few weeks ago, with Dr. Mark Gray. And you need to listen to that show, because he's done a tremendous amount of research, and I've been posting it on my blog and also my Facebook page recently. But he's cracked the code when it comes to this, and I think you really need to listen to it, and you really need to hear what he's come up with, because quite frankly, it's very startling, and it's also very revealing, and it really caps all of your research in this new book that you've come out with, and I think you'll be quite fascinated with it when you actually see it.
Okay, do that. It's very eerie. It's very eerie, because we're beginning to sense, and that's what the Master Game does. That is why it's such a big book, because one needs to go through it very, very carefully and very slowly, because it's a very complex problem that needs to be understood, and needs to be understood by everybody. We're caught in a game here. There's a game that's been being played for the last millennium and a half, and it's taking a rather dangerous shape. It's heading towards, if not stopped, that's why the Master Game is in a sense an alarm bell to somehow see if it can be stopped, because it's heading towards a very, very dangerous showdown. And I'd be very glad to hear what Mark Gray has to say about the 9/11 memorial, because 9/11 is a kind of turning point here, where the game takes a very, very, very dangerous turn, where an organization calling itself Al-Qaeda declares a holy war in the name of Islam, and takes an action to provoke these crusaders, the people that they perceive as crusaders, into a world battle. That is what 9/11 is about. And they're sending these eerie signals, these eerie messages that are very frightening, because they think in symbolic terms that this is what it's about. Their minds, and it's quite possible that the other side, the other players are thinking the same. It is something that we're caught in, and we need to wake up, because we're all very complacent about this. We're all letting the game take place without us being involved. And strangely enough, as you're mentioning the events in Wall Street, suddenly the people are waking up. They're beginning to realize that they've been manipulated. They've been part of some bizarre game involving huge funds, involving huge military actions, and they're just on the sideline, and they're the ones that are suffering. Are we still together here? So this is.
What am I going to do with you?
We've got 5 minutes left, and I want to cap
Rob.
it. I mean, this is what the master game is all about. It's very difficult to do, of course, on a 1 hour talk on the radio, but I hope that the main point
they have to read the book. The book is, it's over 600 pages, and you do a tremendous job of, you and Graham both do a tremendous job of writing about this particular subject. And you know something, I don't believe Al-Qaeda did 9/11, to be honest with you.
Well, we obviously going to agree to disagree on this one. I'm very, very convinced that this is a real attack by Al-Qaeda. What is important is to understand the very roots of it. If not, we're going to make a mess out of this. And I know there's many theories, and many theories suggesting even that the United States itself, or some people controlling the United States government, are involved in this. I'm not on this line of thought, but I know there is many conspiracies, and of course, maybe I'm wrong. But my research and my research with Graham Hancock leads us to the conclusions we arrive in the master game. So there we are. We disagree on one thing, Hillary.
Just one.
Well, we'll find other things,
So far,
I'm sure.
yeah. Well, we're out of time. Thank you so much for being here. As usual, you're captivating, and you're fantastic in your information that you share. And I know everybody listening has been quite captivated as well. The Master Game by Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock. That's what we've been discussing. You can find, Robert, do you have anything coming up? Are you doing any speaking engagements while you're in Washington or New York?
Yes, I'm speaking tomorrow in Washington. Unfortunately, I don't have the details here, but I'll be talking, perhaps more interesting for your listeners in New York. I'll be speaking at the Long Island University on the 9th in the evening, and I'll post the information on my website. So if people want to come and hear this talk, but it's not about the Master Game, it's about Black Genesis, which is another very interesting book, but it's a very different subject.
Well, I want to have you come back on and continue this conversation, but we're out of time. But thank you again for being here.
It was a pleasure, as always, Hillary.